Hi Lorraine, we are to the last section that you need to study before you can take the practice test for the SAT history. This is the 1960 to present day period in US history. So this begins about the time that television was really having an influence on politics, and that's important because in all of our discussion about politics before that, it was mostly print media, some radio, but television really did change the way people had access to the people that were running for office. It was obviously it's visual, so that makes a big difference in people, not just what they hear, but what they see. And people are very much affected by that. And you can tell that in today's world with all of the media attention and how quickly information gets out, and obviously the visual and the being able to hear people's voices and see them, it makes a difference. And one of the first times that that was evident is when Richard Nixon was wanted to be vice president on the ticket with Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and he almost lost it because he was accused of some illegal money laundering, some having a fund that he wasn't supposed to have, and he was about to get kicked off the ticket. He gave a very heartwarming talk that people could see. It was called the Checkers speech. So if you ever hear reference to the Checkers speech, he talked about his dog Checkers. And that made him seemed a little more human, a little more, oh, the guy loves his dogs. He's talked about his dog Checkers. It was a campaign contribution. Somebody had given it to him as a campaign contribution, but he was keeping it because his children loved him so much. And that speech on television made people like him a little more. And that saved his spot on the Eisenhower ticket. And it's just an early example of how being able to see people and how the impact that has on people's perception of them. Now later on, what didn't go so well for him. In 1960, he was debating Democrat John Kennedy, and even though he had won debates before that, and won the debate, Kennedy was very charming, youthful, very appealing to voters. You just have a visual of the two of them, and I believe there were stories about how Nixon was sweating and just looked kind of pale, and he wasn't the best looking guy. So when you have a media that shows visuals of this young, charming, smart guy, and then you have another guy who's thought to be pretty smart also, but he doesn't look great. He looks like he's uncomfortable. He's a little bit sweaty, and he just wasn't as appealing. And, we don't know if that had a lot to do with it, but it does make a difference. Kennedy appealed to a lot of the younger voters, and he won the election. Okay, so things you should know about Lyndon Johnson's Democratic presidency, because we did talk a little bit about the presidency of John Kennedy. It was only 3 years because then he was assassinated. So he did inherit the presidency from Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated. And Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam. If you remember, we were talking about the whole idea of containing communism all over the world, and that's how we got involved in a war so far away. It began earlier, before Johnson, but when Johnson took over the presidency after Kennedy was assassinated, he escalated the war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I know we talked about that in the last chapter when we talked about the Cold War and the idea of trying to contain communism. And then we had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which then gave a blank check basically to Johnson to decide how to pursue that war, which wasn't technically a war. We lost over 50,000 people. So that was what happened at that point. So the Great Society, you'll need to know that term, was a plan to help the poor, minorities, and the disadvantaged. President Johnson was very good at this. He was very pro helping people who were having trouble, poverty, minorities, which was great. He called it the Great Society. It was a plan to help the disadvantaged, poor minorities. He declared a war on poverty, which again was putting the focus on the government getting involved in helping people who needed help, which is what some people think the government should be doing. On the other hand, some people think the government should stay out of everyone's business and just take care of national defense and roads and things like that. So that's that constant argument we've talked about through the years. States' rights, the government having less control and less involvement. So Johnson saw that this was important, so he declared a war on poverty and he increased educational opportunities for all. So he increased the education, which of course also increases the expense. So anytime you do provide services, education, anything against poverty, anything where you're helping people, it does increase government spending, which can be a problem. So that's kind of the trade-off. So in the election of 1964, which was the year after Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson was president because he took it over, but of course then he had to run again in the election of 1964, a year later, he did defeat Republican Barry Goldwater. Goldwater wanted to reduce the government's role concerning social programs. He didn't want to have the aid to the poor and Social Security. Johnson won the election in part to a television commercial because, again, TV at the time was important because people saw ads, which they hadn't seen before in a lot of elections. The one called the Daisy ad portrayed Goldwater as a supporter of using nuclear weapons in military operations. So sometimes if you just get a visual out there that scares people or encourages people or something, and it's on television, whether it's true or not, it sticks sometimes. So Barry Goldwater was defeated by Johnson. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, another really important contribution by Johnson, made all forms of segregation and discrimination illegal. We talked about through the years all the attempts to make it more fair, especially in the South, where it just wasn't ever since the Civil War. Even though it was supposed to be more fair, it wasn't happening. There were so many ways that they were, the Jim Crow laws and keeping black people from voting or having any kind of equal rights. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, very important. You absolutely need to know that. It was under the Johnson administration, and it made it illegal to segregation and discrimination completely illegal on a federal level, which makes it more powerful. In 1965, the Medicare became law, and Medicare is something that's very important to those of us here. It's Medicare. This guarantees health insurance to people over 65 and those with disabilities. And the reason that is so important is that health insurance is a bit of a mess in the United States, has been for a long time, and it's very expensive. So when people get older and they didn't have health insurance and couldn't afford it, they're left without any help. So Medicare became law in 1965, so everybody who turns 65 has a guarantee of medical care. It's not all, sometimes you have to have a supplement, and that's not that important to you. But the important thing is Medicare covers everybody 65 and over in terms of their medical care. Johnson did not run for a full second presidential term. Remember, he had the year after that he inherited from after JFK was assassinated, and then he ran the following year for his first full 4-year term. But he was just so disenchanted and so kind of beaten up over the war in Vietnam, kind of tarnished his legacy, even though he did some great things in terms of fighting poverty and racism. He had just pretty much had enough, and he decided not to run again. The Pentagon Papers were an important thing you need to know. They were meant to be secret, and they were reported by the New York Times in 1971. And they showed that for years the government had been escalating the war in Vietnam, and they weren't telling the public the truth. So when that came out in 1971, and that was a huge deal, the Pentagon Papers, because the government tried to keep that information secret, that they had been escalating the war and it was a secret and nobody knew what was happening. But freedom of the press is very important, that freedom of the press right was again shown to be important, because the Supreme Court in New York Times v. in reverse United States in 1971 stated that the New York Times had the right to publish the Pentagon Papers. They were leaked. They were given to the newspaper, and that's when they found out that it had been secretly escalating the war, that the government had been secretly escalating the war in Vietnam, that people didn't know about it. These papers were marked classified, so it was illegal for anybody to look at them. They were leaked, smuggled out, and given to the paper. The paper wanted to publish them, and after they had the Supreme Court ruled that yes, that the New York Times did have a right to publish them because they were not a threat to national security. That the government was using the concern about national security as a way to keep a secret that they shouldn't have kept from the people. Okay, so what you should know about Richard Nixon's presidency is in 1968, he defeated Johnson's vice president. Remember, Johnson didn't run again, and very often the vice president of that administration will run for president. It's like the vice presidency is kind of a stepping stone. Johnson's vice president was Hubert Humphrey, and he won the Democratic nomination with Robert Kennedy after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's younger brother, and he was running for president, and he was going to be the Democratic nominee in 1968, and he was assassinated. So that was the second Kennedy that was assassinated, either as president or trying to become president. It was terrible. So Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So and then Nixon beat him. Nixon beat him. He probably wouldn't have beaten Robert Kennedy, but he beat him. So Nixon exercised détente diplomacy, which is the easing of the tension between the U.S. and the communist powers. When we talked about the Cold War, the concern about Russia and both of us having nuclear weapons and all that. So that went on for a long time. Détente is the easing of that worry and concern, so the tensions. So we pulled out of Vietnam in 1973 when Nixon was president, but that was after the war continued on under Nixon for a while. He didn't just go into office and pull us out. It went on for a while because he was in 1968 and the war didn't end until 1973. So it went on for a while. He extended something called ping pong diplomacy. Well, that was the U.S. and China had set up a series of ping pong matches between the two nations. I guess that's kind of a getting to know you thing. Let's play ping pong. Since we hadn't had a good relationship before that. Nixon visited communist China and Mao Zedong. And some believe this was the beginning of China's industrial boom that they have today. Ping pong diplomacy. It all starts with getting to know each other, I guess. Congress passed the War Powers Act. This is all more things that happened during the Nixon administration that you might need to know. The War Powers Act states that although the president is commander-in-chief, he can't use extensive overseas force. He can't just go to war, because that's kind of the problem we had before. He can't do that for more than 60 days without the consent of Congress. So no more of the president saying, I'm in charge, so now I'm going to go to war. If he's going to do that, he has to check with Congress. Remember, we have checks and balances. That's what Congress is for. That's what the judicial system is for. So that's part of saying, wait, we need a little bit of input if you're going to be at a war for more than 60 days, if it's going to be long term. Nixon battled a lot of inflation in the 1970s. We had more economic problems. We seem to have those going up and down. Energy prices skyrocketed after OPEC had an oil embargo. That's all with the Middle East, and so we had horrible inflation. Mostly Nixon's presidency would be remembered for partly with the Vietnam War. He did escalate it and then finally just pull out without any great results. But mostly it was a Watergate scandal, and that is a big deal. You need to know Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Nixon became the first president to resign because in 1972, during the presidential election campaign, there was a break-in at the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Nixon was a Republican, so obviously it's the break-in was at the other side. Nixon claimed he didn't know anything about it. He had nothing to do with it. Remember, it's somebody he's running against, so it's the opposite party. It was during a campaign. They they broke in to get information at the Democratic headquarters, and Nixon said, "I know nothing about this. Wasn't me. It wasn't my guys." But there were tapes, because he taped everything in his office, and there were actual tapes that proved that he knew about it, was involved in it, and then had tried to erase a part of it that incriminated him. So United States versus Nixon, 1974, was the Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to release the tapes regarding the scandal. And Nixon was fighting that, hoping to be protected by executive privilege, which is the ability of the president to keep something secret and say, this is confidential. So this is secret and confidential. So he went to the Supreme Court saying, I'm not going to release the tapes that I made about myself. But it didn't really work for him. So after his vice president resigned, after he said that he would plead no contest to some problems he was having about his tax records. So Nixon's vice president resigned. And then Nixon resigned in 1974 because he was going to be impeached for obstructing justice, because he had lied. Obviously, he knew that they were breaking into the Democratic headquarters to help him because he was a Republican running for presidency. So his vice president resigned because of tax evasion, and then he resigned in 1974 because he was going to be impeached, and that means where you get basically thrown out of office. First the House votes to impeach you, and then the Senate has to vote to follow up with that, and then you have to actually leave office. He was pretty sure that was going to happen because he'd been obstructing justice and there were tapes and it was obvious. To this day, he's the only president ever to resign. Now, he's not the only president to be technically, well, he wasn't impeached, but they would have impeached him. Bill Clinton was also impeached by the House, but when it went to the Senate, he was not impeached. So it was an impeachment on paper, but it never went to the full, all the way where he was ever asked to leave. And that had to do with Monica Lewinsky and having an inappropriate relationship and lying about it is what that was about, lying about an inappropriate relationship while he was president with an intern. But so he was impeached technically by the House. They basically bring the charges, but then the Senate didn't vote to impeach. So then he stayed in office with the impeachment on his record. All right, so important things you need to know about this time period also. The Equal Rights Amendment. Now, that was first proposed in 1923. So this had been going on for quite a while. It was an amendment to ensure equal rights for women under the law. A good thing to have. It was proposed in 1923. It was passed finally in the House and Senate in 1972. That's kind of a long period to wait. Problem is, the states never ratified it. Anytime you have an amendment, remember that it has to be passed by the House and Senate, and then the states have to ratify it, just like in everything else we've talked about. The states have to vote on it and agree to it. Well, they never ratified it, so at a certain point it expires. It's like, okay, if you're not going to ratify it, it's going to go away. So it expired in 1982. So we never did have the Equal Rights for Women amendment that most women wanted. All right, some of the names you need to know along this idea of equal rights for women. Betty Friedan, famous feminist who wrote The Feminine Mystique, and her last name is Friedan. And the book she's most famous for is The Feminine Mystique, Mystique. She supported equal rights for women and was the first president of the National Organization for Women, which the acronym is NOW, N-O-W, National Organization for Women. Okay, another one is Phyllis Schlafly, not on the same page as Betty Friedan. Her last name was Schlafly, Schlafly. She was opposed to feminism. She was against the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment. She thought it would hurt the traditional family and put women into situations where she didn't think they should be in, like the military draft. So she did not want women to be have an amendment that they were equal, or had equal opportunity. Okay. Around the same time, 1973, the Supreme Court supported a woman's right to choose to have an abortion in the landmark case, and this is a very important case. It's still being debated today, so you definitely need to know this. Roe v. Wade, it's R-O-E, verse, or V, Wade, W-A-D-E. And this was the landmark decision that gave women the right to choose to have an abortion, because the court ruled that a woman's privacy, this was based on privacy, privacy was protected by the Fourth Amendment, as well as the Ninth Amendment's reservation of rights for the people. Remember, if it isn't stated in the Constitution or in the rights, then the right is for the people. Just because you didn't say it doesn't mean they don't get it if you don't specifically have something taking it away. So the Fourth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, protection of personal liberty. So 3 amendments were used in the case of Roe v. Wade to support the women's right to choose. It's up to them, their body, their choice, whether to have an abortion. So that is supported by the 4th Amendment, the 9th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment protecting personal liberty. All right, today women can't be barred from a job based on their gender. States can't have age requirements that favor men. They can't have 2 different legal working ages for men and women. Title IX of the Education Amendment was a really good thing for women in education and sports. It was passed in 1972, and it prevents gender discrimination in educational activities such as sports. So if you are giving scholarships to basketball players at a college, or you need to have some also for the women's team. And just like if you have teams in high school for one sport that's for boys, then you need to provide that for the girls too, so that everybody has equal opportunity. It doesn't seem like it'd be that difficult to figure out that would be fair. So although women have some equality of rights, the fact is that they still are not treated fairly. They're still paid less than men who have similar jobs. In more recent decades, there have been more strict sexual harassment laws to keep women from not being discriminated against. But so much of what goes on that isn't fair to women goes on below the radar. I think we've all experienced it. We've all seen it. We all know about it. So it's still there. There have been a lot of progress. It's not there yet. All right. So some of the famous names you should know: Friedan and Schlafly for sure. Remember, Betty Friedan was pro women's rights and women's equal opportunity, and Schlafly was no, the woman basically belongs in the home, and if they have too many equal rights, they might be put in positions that she didn't think women should be in, like in the military. Okay, some other things you'll need to know in terms of the women in that time period, some names, especially in literature and this popular culture. Rachel Carson, C-A-R-S-O-N, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and it's a 1962 book, and it gets a lot of credit for helping to launch the environmental movement. It helped to ban certain pesticides, including DDT. That was in Silent Spring, was about the pollution and the horrible things that were caused by the DDT pesticide. In later years, you should know about the Clean Air Act of 1970, which was trying to reduce pollution, auto emissions, and the Water Pollution Control Act of 1972, trying to rid rivers and lakes of pollution. So these are important because you're seeing how the country is moving forward in maybe giving women rights, how women are getting more involved in the in society in terms of promoting change, and that things are kind of moving forward in that area, and you just need to kind of be aware of that. Some of the other people you need to know: Andy Warhol, you might have heard of him, W-A-R-H-O-L. He was a famous filmmaker, author, and artist. He was most famous for some of the pop art, images of the pop culture used in art. One of his most famous creations was a Campbell's soup cans in 1962. You can look it up and see. It's really famous. art is one of those things that it's kind of, people look at it and they have different ideas and perspectives. But the name Andy Warhol, if you're talking about our history, our culture, the changes that our country was going through, you need to be aware of his name. And if you're associating it with a piece of art, think of the Campbell soup cans in 1962. Think of pop culture, images of pop culture that Andy Warhol is famous for. Ralph Nader, he was a consumer advocate, very important guy who worked very hard at trying to make sure that the consumer was protected in everything from food safety to automotive safety. In 1965, he wrote his most famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed. His name is Ralph Nader, Nader. He challenged the auto industry to make safer cars because remember the industries, businesses, from what we read earlier, they're usually more concerned about money and profit than they are about the consumer safety, and sometimes they need to be forced into taking a look at that. So he wrote a famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed. He challenged the auto industry to make safer cars. Later on, Ralph Nader ran as a third-party candidate, and you know what happens with third-party candidates. We talked about that before. It kind of put a kink in the election between when George Bush ran for president, and actually George Bush won because Ralph Nader split off some of the Democratic vote. Instead of Republicans and Democrats, you had Republicans, Democrats, and then Ralph Nader was an independent Green Party, I think. So that took off enough of the Democrats that the Republican won. And that's pretty much what happens anytime you have three parties, three candidates, is you're going to, it's going to split the vote, which we've talked about some of the other earlier elections where that also happened. Some other names, Benjamin Spock. Spock, not like Star Trek, but he was a pediatrician. He was a doctor who wrote the common sense book, A Baby in Childcare. The reason that's important is it was one of the biggest best-selling books about raising children. It was published in 1946, but it was so popular that they kept making new publications and new editions into the 1990s. And it just kind of shows what's going on in the country in terms of child care, parents' involvement with their children, how that changed. Remember we talked back about from the colonial period going on, the family dynamics and children. So this was just kind of an interesting time period where there was a lot of writing and talk about children and parents and how to raise children. So Benjamin Spock, babies. Think of Benjamin Spock, the baby books, and they went up into the 90s. Cesar Chavez, we talked about the other day, United Farm Workers. He is the guy who called for boycotts to help farm laborers get better pay and safer working conditions. That's where we had to sometimes boycott lettuce and grapes and things that were being picked by migrant farm workers who were not getting paid very much money and were living in pretty awful conditions. So Cesar Chavez was in support of them, would call for boycotts or strikes, boycotts of the foods, to try to force the farmers to pay their workers more. So that's why we didn't eat grapes and lettuce in those years. Another definition you need to know is affirmative action. That's still discussed and debated today, whether that is something that should be enforced. Affirmative action is a government policy that ensures that women and minorities have equal opportunity for jobs, school admissions, and other benefits. It's created to prevent discrimination in hiring practice. You know, like saying that you have to have, that you cannot discriminate against women, and then the fact is that affirmative action means you need to make room for a certain number of people who are not just your regular white men. You have to include women and minorities in when you're for the jobs and in school. So it's created to prevent discrimination in hiring. Now it's come under fire. Now it's being attacked for reverse discrimination, saying that people who aren't minorities, including women, are being hurt because they are not getting jobs they should have and that they actually qualify for, because affirmative action means that you have to hire, say, a minority person or a woman to take that position when really the man was the best qualified. So therefore the man who they think is the best qualified doesn't get the job, so now we have reverse discrimination. It's tricky. The idea is that what you need to know is affirmative action is taking an action pro trying to make sure that women and minorities have benefits and jobs and are hired, even if it's through, basically force. You have to hire a certain number of people in these positions or allow these in school so that more people have those opportunities. All right, 1978, court case, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, B-A-K-K-E. Okay, Alan Bakke claimed he was denied admission to medical school because he was white. And this is the whole reverse discrimination. The school had a plan in place that set quotas for minority students, saying that we need to have a certain number of minority students. So in order to do that, we're going to say you can get lower grades, but you can still get in, which some see as not being fair to the white guy, Alan, who had really good grades and qualified and should be allowed in, but he's getting bumped for a minority student whose grades aren't as good just to meet the quotas. So the 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in Regents of University of California versus Bakke, whatever it is, that the school could consider race as part of the admission process. Having a strict racial quota actually violated the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. So Alan Bakke was admitted as a student because the ruling said you can use race as part of it, but you can't have a strict quota that then just kicks out a guy who really did deserve to be there. That's just not fair. That violates the 14th Amendment and civil rights. It's still being debated now, what's fair, what's not fair about affirmative action. Okay, so moving on to Gerald Ford, Republican president, 1974 to 1977. All right, and this was interesting because, remember, Spiro Agnew resigned because he had issues on his taxes and basically fraud. So he had to resign. Gerald Ford was appointed to the vice presidency, so he was never elected as vice president. He wasn't on the Nixon ticket. He was given that job when Spiro Agnew had to leave because he was in trouble. Well, then when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president. So he's the first president who was actually not elected. He was not elected as vice president on a ticket because he took over for a vice president. He was not elected as president. He just kind of moved up in the ranks as other people got kicked off for doing bad things. So that always was a little bit hard for everyone and for him because he never was really chosen. He just kind of moved up when it was needed. And after taking office, he pardoned or forgave Nixon for his crime because at that point, everyone wanted Nixon, who had just left office because he had lied about the Watergate scandal and what he knew and wouldn't give over the tapes. And it was a huge mess. And so instead of him being charged criminally, which he would have been, he was pardoned by the new president, which the president has a right to do. That was very controversial. People were very angry about it because they wanted Nixon held accountable for what he had done. But at the time, Ford believed that the country had gone through so much turmoil and anger that it would be best not to have their president in a courtroom being prosecuted, to get that behind us so the country could move forward and heal. So that was always a controversy, but that's what happened. All right, so then moving on to Jimmy Carter, who is a Democrat, in 1977 to 81. Now, Ford only lasted that one term. He was not elected, and he was not elected a second time. So Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer and governor of Georgia. And he was a Washington outsider. He wasn't involved in politics. He was kind of a quiet guy, actually a really good guy, who was a peanut farmer, and he was governor of Georgia, and he was elected, and then he had a lot of problems. He was actually a really good guy, and after he left office, he spent the next 30 years working to help improve the lives of people in poverty. His foundation has done many, many things. in terms of building houses and just helping people in poverty. He's a good guy. He had a lot of problems as the president because there was high inflation, slow growth, and high unemployment. One of the things he did that he is well known for that was really good as president is he negotiated the Camp David Accords of 1978. Carter has always been very pro-peace, very much trying to get the people to work things out, kind of a quiet guy. So he didn't always fit in with Washington and the deal making and all the things you have to do. That's why they call him a Washington outsider. But he did negotiate the Camp David Accords, and that's where Egypt agreed to recognize Israel as a nation in exchange for Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula. So it was a bit of a peace treaty, and it calmed things down in the Middle East. It was a very big deal at the time. That's the president to be able to do that. So Carter, think of President Carter as, although he had to deal with a lot of inflation, bad growth, slow growth, high unemployment, he was an outsider. He was the governor of Georgia. He did, when he was in office, negotiate the Camp David Accord between Egypt and Israel, which was a big deal. Then we had some definite problems. In 1979, Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, and American hostages were held for 444 days, which just really, the morale in the U.S. went down quite a bit. We had people from our embassy being held in Iran. They were hostages. There were rescue attempts that failed. There really wasn't much Carter could have done about it, looking back on it, and he actually did negotiate, and for some reason they wanted to punish him because even though they negotiated, the hostages were released on the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated after he beat Carter. So it was a little bit of a game there for Iran, I guess. So for 444 days, Americans were held hostage. That really hurt the morale of the U.S., especially after a rescue attempt failed. Ronald Reagan so Jimmy Carter lost his second bid at becoming president for the second time. He lost his second term. He was only in for one term. Ronald Reagan beat him, and on Inauguration Day, the Iranians let the American hostages go. So the crisis coincided with the Iranian Revolution, where U.S. ally Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini took power. That all happened at the same time. So there you go. In 1973, before Carter became president, Arab members of the OPEC nation, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, proclaimed an oil embargo against the United States to protest the American military support for Israel. So the Americans support Israel, and the OPEC didn't like that in the Middle East, so they had an oil embargo, which means they wouldn't give us any oil. They wouldn't send us any oil. So that resulted in an energy crisis in the early 70s. We had gas rationing. You could only go get gas if your license plate was an odd or an even. There were huge lines for gas. It was a big deal. It hurt our economy. It made Americans angry, didn't like being dependent on the Middle East for oil. So gas rationing took place at that time. Iran became unstable in 1979, and then OPEC once again sent the price of oil skyrocketing. So those high energy prices, the fuel shortages, all of these things added to the problems that Carter had in his first term as president, which made it why he couldn't get the second term. In 1979, there was a partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in Pennsylvania. And this was one of the first things that led people to question whether nuclear power was really safe and if it should be used as an alternate energy source. The problem is that when you're kind of being held hostage with your oil in the Middle East, and we see what it's like to not have access to oil or gas for our cars, and you see where people start trying to figure out what's the alternative for any kind of power so that we can be more independent. And that's still going on today. A little bit better, but still going on. All right, so moving on to some of the other things were going on in society at the time. The Christian right is a term you need to know. In reaction to some of the more liberal social policies, and liberal just means a little more open, a little more progressive, liberal social policies such as the Equal Rights Amendment, legalizing abortion. Remember the Roe v. Wade, where it was up to a woman to choose what to do with her body.